The grocery store parking lot was where I first saw my son walk. Not shuffle. Not lean on anything. Walk. 6 years I'd been helping him into the car, carrying his groceries, watching him grip the armrest like his life depended on it. 6 years of watching him say he couldn't work. That day, he didn't see me. He was too busy laughing with a friend, loading bags into a truck bed with one hand while the other stayed in his pocket. I sat in my car for 40 minutes and didn't drive away. I counted the things I'd paid for instead. The list took a while. Before I get to that afternoon, I want to ask you something first. Have you ever given everything you had to someone, not because they asked for it the right way, but because you loved them and couldn't imagine doing anything else? Think about that for a moment. What would it take for you to realize that the person you were carrying had been walking on their own the whole time? What would you call that feeling? The one where the ground you thought you were standing on turns out to have been held up by someone else's story the entire time. Now let me tell you how I got to that parking lot. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 62 years old. For 22 years, I worked as an insurance investigator out of Portland, the kind of job where you spend most of your time watching people, learning the difference between what they say and what their body does when they think no one is paying attention. I was good at it. I retired at 58 with a clean record, a decent pension, and what I thought was a solid understanding of human behavior. I thought that experience had made me harder to fool. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about it for 6 years. Marcus came into my life when he was 9 years old. Ellen and I had been married 3 years by then, and Marcus was her son from her first marriage, a quiet kid with dark eyes and a habit of watching doorways before he walked through them, like he was always calculating exits. We adopted him formally when he was 11. I taught him to drive in the parking lot of a Safeway on Southeast Powell. I sat in the bleachers at every track meet he ran in high school, and he ran fast back then, long legs. Good form. The kind of stride that looked almost effortless. He placed second at regionals his junior year. I still have the photograph somewhere, him crossing the finish line, arms out, face open with something that looked like pure surprise at himself. That was the Marcus I knew first, the one who existed before the accident. The accident happened 6 years ago, in the fall, at a warehouse job he'd been working for about 8 months. A pallet shifted wrong, caught him on the left side, and he went down hard on a concrete floor. The injury report said lumbar strain with nerve involvement L4 and L5, the kind of damage that can be real and serious and genuinely debilitating. I know that. I knew it then. The doctors used words like chronic pain management and functional limitation and reduced mobility, and I listened to all of it and believed every word, because why wouldn't I? This was my son. By the time the workers' compensation ran out, Marcus had moved back in with us. The house on Burnside had 2 bedrooms, and we converted the study into a room for him. Ground floor, close to the bathroom. We rented a wider unit the following spring, $200 a month, up from $450 because the new place had a layout that worked better for the wheelchair. The folding chair lived in the corner by the front door. The grab bars went up in the bathroom in November of that first year. A man named Dale from a medical supply company in Beaverton came out and bolted them to the tile himself, and I wrote him a check for $340 and thanked him. The medical costs settled into a rhythm. Physical therapy twice a week at a clinic on Barber Boulevard, $180 a session, not fully covered. Medications, a rotating combination of muscle relaxants, nerve pain blockers, and anti-inflammatories that ran about $310 a month after insurance. Specialist visits, equipment maintenance, the occasional imaging order when Marcus said the pain had shifted or worsened. I kept a spreadsheet. The monthly total, averaged across the first 2 years, was just under $400 for medical alone. Add the $800 I paid toward his personal care, a part-time aide 3 mornings a week, groceries, the things he couldn't do himself, and the $200 rent, and the number sitting at the bottom of my spreadsheet each month was somewhere around $7,400. 6 years. I used the last of the savings account Ellen and I had built together over 15 years. I sold the rental property on Milwaukee Avenue in year 3, the one my father had left me, the one I'd always planned to pass along eventually for $270,000, and I put most of it back into Marcus's care within 18 months. I borrowed $40,000 from my friend Ray Hutchins, who has known me since 1994, and who handed me a personal check without asking for paperwork. The total, if I'm being precise about it, came to just over $450,000. Every morning, I set his medications on the kitchen counter in the blue plastic organizer Ellen had labeled by day. Every afternoon, on the days there was no aid, I drove him to Barber Boulevard and waited in the parking lot while he was inside with the therapist. Every night before I went to bed, I checked the charging status on the backup medical alert device we kept on his nightstand. I did all of it because I loved him. That part is not complicated, and I won't pretend it is. What I sat in that parking lot thinking about for those 40 minutes was not the money. The money was a number. What I sat there thinking about was the blue pill organizer and the grab bars and Dale from Beaverton and Ray Hutchins's personal check. I thought about the track meet photograph and the kid who used to watch doorways before walking through them. I thought about 6 years of mornings and what they had actually meant. Then I drove home. I didn't say anything to Ellen that night. I made dinner, washed the dishes, and went to bed at the usual time. I lay there in the dark, and I thought about the way Marcus had loaded those bags easy, fluid, one-handed, and I thought about something I used to say to new investigators when I was training them: the body doesn't lie as well as the mouth does. You just have to know what to look for. I had spent 22 years knowing exactly what to look for. Before Marcus was hurt, we worked the same sites sometimes. Not often. I was mostly on the inspection side by then. And he was in the trades, but occasionally a job would overlap, and we'd end up on the same crew for a week or two. He was a good worker, methodical, careful with measurements, the kind of man who swept his section of the floor at the end of the day without being asked. I watched him once carry a 60-pound bag of concrete mix up a flight of temporary stairs without breaking stride. He was 32 then. He moved like someone who had never thought about his body as a limitation. The accident happened on a Thursday in late October 6 years ago. A scaffold brace gave way on a residential project in Beaverton. Marcus fell 11 feet and landed on his left side. 2 broken ribs, a compressed vertebra at L4, and soft tissue damage along the left hip. The ER physician, a young woman whose name I no longer remember, told us that injuries like this were painful and serious, but that with proper physical therapy and time, most patients in Marcus's age range achieved full or near full recovery. 12 to 18 months, she said. She said it the way doctors say things that are meant to be reassuring. We brought him home to recover. Ellen set up the back bedroom with a hospital-grade mattress and a grab bar in the bathroom. I paid for it. I didn't think twice about paying for it. He was my son. At 3 months, Marcus told us he still couldn't stand for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. At 6 months, he said the pain was worse than it had been in the beginning some days. He said he could barely make it to the kitchen. At 1 year, he sat across from Ellen and me at the dinner table and told us that his doctor had revised the prognosis. He said the word chronic. He said he would need to manage his condition long term. He said he didn't think he'd ever go back to construction. My son said he couldn't work anymore. I believed him. I paid for everything: the follow-up appointments, the prescription anti-inflammatories, the second opinion we drove to Seattle for, the adjustable bed frame, the 3 months of physical therapy that Marcus stopped attending because he said it made the pain worse. I paid his portion of the utilities when he moved back in with us. I paid his phone bill when Ellen suggested we convert the garage into a proper room so he'd have more privacy. I hired the contractor and wrote the check. I told myself this was what you did. You showed up. You didn't make a man feel like a burden when he was already suffering. Ellen cooked his meals most evenings. She learned which positions were comfortable for him and rearranged the living room furniture so he could move through it more easily. She drove him to appointments on days when he said the pain was too sharp for him to drive himself. She did all of it without complaint, and I loved her for it, and I never once questioned whether we were doing the right thing. What I did not do, what neither of us did, was ask Marcus why, at 18 months, and then at 2 years, and then at 3, he was still not better. He spoke occasionally about trying to find desk work, something that wouldn't require him to be on his feet. Nothing ever came of it. He'd look into it next month. He said he'd feel more ready after the winter. He said the pain came and went in ways that were hard to predict. He said we accepted every explanation. We rearranged our lives around them, and Marcus stayed in the back bedroom, and the years moved past us the way years do when you are not watching them closely enough. The requests started small enough that I didn't recognize them as requests. By the 4th year, the pattern had its own grammar. He wouldn't say he needed something. He would describe a difficulty. He would say he'd tried to schedule the appointment himself, but that the online portal was confusing, that his concentration wasn't what it used to be. He would say he hated to be a burden often enough that it had become a kind of wallpaper, present everywhere, noticed by no one. Have you ever watched someone rearrange a room so gradually that you only notice the furniture is in different places after you've already tripped over it? One Saturday in late spring, I mentioned at breakfast that I was thinking of driving out to Gresham to see my brother. I hadn't been in 3 months. By Friday evening, Marcus had mentioned that his knee had been particularly bad that week and that he might need help getting to his follow-up on Saturday morning. Not a demand, a disclosure. He was simply telling me how things stood. I canceled Gresham. I drove him to the appointment. I waited in the parking lot on Barber Boulevard for 45 minutes while he was inside, and when he came out, he said, "Dr. Keller thought the inflammation was cycling again and that he might need to add a second anti-inflammatory." I said I'd call the pharmacy. He thanked me. He said he didn't know what he'd do without me. I worked 3 days a week by then. Ellen worked part-time at a dental office on Hawthorne. We managed. That was the word we used. I am describing this carefully because I want to be accurate about what I missed and for how long I missed it. I was a claims investigator for 22 years. I spent those years looking for exactly this pattern in strangers, the gradual reshaping of another person's behavior through carefully managed disclosure, through the strategic placement of need. I was good at finding it in strangers. I was not good at finding it in my own house. The first thing I noticed, the first thing I let myself notice, was the kitchen. It was a Wednesday in March. Ellen had left for work at 7:30. I told Marcus at breakfast that I had a meeting in the afternoon, a consulting call with an old colleague from my claims days, and that I'd be in my office with the door closed from 1 until 3. He nodded. He said that was fine, that he would probably rest. I closed my office door at 1 o'clock. At 1:45, I opened it. The kitchen, which I had left with 2 coffee mugs on the counter and a pan soaking in the sink, was clean. The mugs were in the drying rack. The pan had been washed and set on the stove. The counter had been wiped. There was a faint smell of dish soap. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked to Marcus's room and knocked. He said, "Come in." He was in bed, his leg elevated on the wedge pillow, his eyes half closed in a way that suggested he had recently arranged himself into that position. I said I was making coffee and asked if he wanted any. He said no, thank you. I said the kitchen looked clean. He said he'd managed to get up for a few minutes around noon and had wanted to help out. I said that was thoughtful of him. Then I went back to my office and sat down. In 22 years of claims investigation, I had learned that a single inconsistency proves nothing. What it does is change the quality of your attention. I did not pick up the phone. I did not say anything to Ellen. What I did was begin to watch differently, not with suspicion, exactly, with the particular stillness of a man who has started listening to a sound he cannot yet identify. 2 weeks later, I came home from a grocery run 40 minutes earlier than I'd said I would. I'd forgotten my wallet and turned around in the parking lot of the Fred Meyer on Lombard. When I came through the back door, I heard Marcus in the hallway. He was on the phone. His voice was clear and easy, the voice of someone in a good mood, telling a story, laughing at something the other person had said. There was no flatness in it, no careful management of volume or pace. He said, "No, I'm serious. I felt fine yesterday. I just didn't want to deal with the whole." And then he heard the door and stopped. By the time I reached the hallway, he was leaning against the wall with his weight shifted to his right side, the way he always stood when someone was watching. He said he'd been talking to Kevin. I said that was fine. He said Kevin had been asking how he was doing. I said that was nice of Kevin. I went to get my wallet from the counter where I'd left it and drove back to Fred Meyer. I paid for everything that day with a credit card I didn't usually carry. I don't know why I remember that detail. I remember it. The call came on a Thursday in April. Carol Brennan lives 4 houses down, on the same side of the street. She's 58, retired from Providence Hospital after 30 years as a floor nurse, and she has the particular observational habit of someone who spent 3 decades tracking small changes in the people under her care. She called me at 11 in the morning. She said she had run into Marcus at the Whole Foods on N.W. Thurman about an hour earlier. She said she'd almost not recognized him at first because he was moving quickly. Her word was quickly through the produce section with a hand basket. She said he had picked up a bag of potatoes with one hand and examined the bottom of it, the way you do when you're checking for soft spots, and then put it back and picked up another one. She said he had not been using the cart for support. She said he had been on his phone, talking and laughing. She said she had almost called out to him, but then something had stopped her. She said she wasn't sure what. She said she hoped she wasn't speaking out of turn. I told her she was not speaking out of turn. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated the call. That same afternoon, Carol came over. She does that sometimes, brings something from her garden, or asks about the recycling schedule, or just stops by because she's been a neighbor long enough that stopping by doesn't require a reason. She was still on the porch when Marcus appeared in the doorway behind me, moving slowly, the cane in his left hand. Carol looked at him. She had seen him an hour ago at Whole Foods, moving quickly through the produce section with a hand basket. She looked at the cane now. She didn't say anything, but I watched her face do the math. Marcus said, "Hey, Carol, bad day today. The cold front's doing something to my hip." Carol said, "I'm sorry to hear that." "It comes and goes," he said. He shifted his weight carefully, the way he always did when someone was watching. "I was just telling Dad I looked into that data entry position he found, the one at the insurance office on Burnside." He glanced at me. "I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Sitting for 8 hours straight, with my back the way it is, I'd be worse off at the end of the week than the beginning." I had found that listing 2 days earlier and left it on the kitchen table without comment. The hours were flexible. The office had an ergonomic setup. The commute was 4 blocks. "I just don't want to start something I can't finish." Marcus said, "That wouldn't be fair to anyone." Carol nodded. She looked at me once, briefly, and then looked back at Marcus. "Of course," she said. "You have to be careful." After she left, I stood in the doorway for a moment. The cane was leaning against the wall again. Marcus had already moved back toward the couch. I went inside and closed the door. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I drank it anyway. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard, and then it stopped, and the street was quiet. The Blue Pill Organizer every morning, from October to October, 6 times over. The prescriptions, the co-pays, the specialist appointments in Lake Oswego, the ergonomic mattress that cost $1,100 because his back needed the particular support. The Saturday I canceled Gresham, the Tuesday mornings, and the phone calls I'd taken in parking lots because Marcus had a question about his insurance paperwork that couldn't wait. I did not pick up the phone again. I did not call Ellen. I sat at that table, and I thought about a man I had investigated in 2007, a longshoreman in Astoria, who had claimed a back injury that left him unable to lift more than 15 pounds. I had watched him for 11 days before I filmed him loading furniture into a moving truck on a Sunday afternoon. I remembered the particular quality of that moment, not triumph, not anger, just the cold, clarifying sensation of a thing that had been uncertain, becoming certain. I got up, rinsed my mug, and went to my office. I had some calls to make. Not to anyone Marcus knew. Not yet. The next morning, I pulled out a legal pad, the same yellow ones I used to fill during surveillance cases, and wrote 3 columns across the top. Observations, questions, actions. Old habits from 22 years of insurance investigation don't leave you when you retire. They just go quiet, waiting. The first call I made was to Ray Hutchins, who had worked fraud cases alongside me at Pacific Mutual for 9 years before he moved to a smaller firm in Salem. Ray still had access to the kind of background tools that a retired man in Portland couldn't reach on his own. I told him I needed a favor, personal, not professional, and that I'd explain when I could. Ray said, "Give me a name and a date of birth." That was the thing about Ray. He didn't ask why. He'd seen enough to know that when a man with my background called asking for a quiet favor, the reason was usually one he'd understand without explanation. Marcus David Whitmore, born March 9, 1986. Ray called back in 48 hours. He read the results the way he always had, flat and without editorial, like a man reading a grocery list. Marcus had a credit card I had never seen, opened 14 months ago through a regional bank in Eugene, not tied to any account I had co-signed, not mentioned once in any of the conversations about finances that Marcus and I had sat through at the kitchen table, the ones where he told me his savings were gone, where he told me he couldn't work anymore, where he told me the disability paperwork was taking longer than expected. I wrote the card number on the legal pad and drew a line under it. Ray had pulled 3 months of transaction history. I read through it twice, standing at my desk. Grocery runs I might have expected a man living in his childhood bedroom still eats, but there were restaurant charges, not fast food, sit-down places, mid-range, the kind where you stay for an hour. There were charges at a hardware store in northeast Portland, 2 of them, spaced 6 weeks apart, and then, near the bottom of the second month, a recurring charge $47 every Tuesday to a business called Cascade Fit on Southeast Division Street. A gym membership, weekly, $47 every single Tuesday for at least 3 months. I set the paper down on the desk. Outside, a car passed on the street. The house was quiet. Down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of the television in Marcus's room, something with a laugh track. Low volume. Earlier that morning, Ellen had brought him his coffee and his morning medication, and I had heard him say his hip was worse than yesterday, that the pressure changes with the rain were doing something to his nerve. Ellen had said she was sorry, that she'd call Dr. Keller's office if he needed her to. Marcus had said maybe, let him see how the day went. I stood at my desk and looked at the line on the legal pad. $47. Every Tuesday. The man who told my wife he couldn't walk to the kitchen without his cane had, according to a credit card I wasn't supposed to know about, been paying for a gym membership for at least 12 weeks. I did not go down the hall. I did not knock on his door. I paid for everything in this house, the mortgage, the groceries, the medication copays, the physical therapy sessions that Dr. Keller billed at $90 an hour, and I had been doing it for 6 years on the understanding that Marcus could not work anymore, that the accident had taken something permanent from him, that the least a father could do was keep the lights on while his son tried to find his footing again. 6 years. I had stopped counting the dollars 2 years in because the number had started to feel like a weight I couldn't afford to look at directly. I closed the legal pad and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a folder of old case files from 2011. That evening, dinner was the same as most evenings. Ellen made the pasta Marcus liked, the one with the sausage and the roasted peppers, because he'd mentioned the day before that he was having a hard week. He sat at the table with the cane hooked over the back of his chair. He talked about a documentary he'd watched, asked Ellen about her sister's new house in Bend, thanked her for the pasta. He was easy company when he wanted to be. He had always been easy company. I watched him reach across the table for the salt shaker without hesitating. His arm moved smoothly, shoulder rotating without any of the compensating stiffness I'd seen him perform 100 times in front of Ellen, in front of Dr. Keller, in front of me. He didn't notice that I noticed. He never had. I asked him how his hip felt. He said it was about a 4 out of 10 today, better than yesterday. I said I was glad to hear it. I refilled his water glass without being asked. He thanked me. After dinner, I washed the dishes and Ellen dried. She was quieter than usual, and at one point she set down a plate and rubbed the back of her neck with both hands, eyes closed for a moment. I asked if she was all right. She said she was just tired. She said it the way people say it when they mean something more specific, but haven't found the words yet. I didn't push. I dried my hands and said I was going to turn in early. Back in my office, I opened the bottom drawer and took out the legal pad. I added a fourth column, evidence. Then I started a new list. The camera was small enough to fit inside a smoke detector housing. I'd bought it at an electronics supply shop on Burnside, paid cash, which was a habit from my old work that I'd never quite dropped. It took me 11 minutes to install it on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was still asleep, and I was out of the house before he woke up. The lens had a clear line of sight to the couch, the coffee table, and the entrance to the kitchen hallway. I tested the feed from my phone in the parking lot of a hardware store 3 blocks away. The picture was clear. For the first 4 days, the footage showed nothing I didn't already know. Marcus on the couch. Marcus with the television on. Marcus with his legs elevated on the cushioned footrest I'd bought him 18 months ago because he said the angle helped with the nerve pain. He moved slowly, carefully, the way he always moved when I was home. I watched each evening's recording in my office with the door closed and felt, each time, the specific discomfort of a man looking for something he isn't sure he wants to find. On the 5th day, 43 minutes after I left for my morning appointment with a client in Lake Oswego, Marcus stood up. Not slowly, not with the careful bracing movements he used when I was in the room, the hand on the armrest, the controlled exhale, the pause before shifting weight. He stood up the way a man stands up when he's been sitting too long and wants to stretch. One motion. He walked into the kitchen with a normal gait, opened the refrigerator, and stood there for a moment looking inside. Then he made himself breakfast. Eggs. From what I could see, he moved around the counter without holding anything for support. I watched that clip 4 times. Over the next 9 days, the pattern was consistent. He waited approximately 30 to 40 minutes after I left, long enough, I suppose, to be certain I wasn't coming back for something forgotten, and then he moved freely through the house. He vacuumed the living room once. He carried a laundry basket from the bedroom to the utility room without stopping to rest. On the 11th day, he opened the back door and went out into the yard, and the camera lost him, but I could see his posture as he crossed the threshold. There was nothing wrong with his posture. Then Kevin called. Kevin Marsh had worked with me at the firm for 6 years before he moved to a claims position at a company in Beaverton. We had lunch maybe twice a year. He was not a man who called without a reason. He said he'd been at Laurelhurst Park that Saturday with his daughter. He said he'd seen a man he thought was Marcus. He wasn't certain at first, because the man was running. He'd watched for a few minutes. Then he'd taken out his phone. He sent me the photos while we were still on the call. There were 7 of them. In the first, Marcus was mid-stride on the basketball court near the east entrance of the park, both feet off the ground. In the third, he had the ball above his head, arms fully extended, preparing to shoot. In the 5th, he was laughing at something someone had said, head tilted back, completely relaxed. In the 7th, he was jogging to retrieve a ball that had rolled toward the fence, moving at a pace that most healthy men his age would consider ordinary. He was wearing the gray athletic shoes I'd bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. He'd said he liked the cushioning. He said it helped when he had to walk longer distances on bad days. I set the phone face down on my desk. 6 years. I'd paid for everything, the medical equipment, the prescriptions, the modifications to the bathroom, the weekly physical therapy copays, the groceries, the utilities, the car insurance on a car he said he could no longer safely drive. I had refinanced once. I had not taken a vacation. I had told myself, every time the numbers became difficult, that this was what you did for your child. The phone was still face down. Outside, it had started to rain, the way it rains in Portland in late October, not dramatically, just steadily, like something that intends to continue. I turned the phone over and looked at the 5th photograph again. Marcus, laughing. I picked up the legal pad and added a single line beneath the word evidence. Then I opened a new contact in my phone and typed a name I hadn't dialed in 3 years. The number rang 4 times before she picked up. Dr. Keller's office. This is Sandra. Her voice was the same as I remembered it measured, slightly formal, the voice of someone who had learned to hold difficult conversations without letting them become dramatic. "Sandra, it's Gerald Whitmore, Marcus's father." A pause. Not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. "Mr. Whitmore, it's been a while." "It has," I said. "I'm sorry to call without warning. I have a request, and I want to be straightforward with you about why I'm making it." The rain tapped steadily against the kitchen window. I had written 4 lines on the legal pad by then, and I had crossed out 2 of them. The words I kept were simple: 1 more evaluation and in person. "I'd like you to come to the house," I said, "to evaluate Marcus again. A full session range of motion, strength testing, the functional assessment, whatever you'd normally do in your office. I want to see it done here." Another pause. "Is something wrong with Marcus?" "That's what I'm trying to determine," I said. "I've been watching him for a while now, and some things aren't adding up the way I expected them to. I'm not making accusations. I just want to see an evaluation done properly by someone who knows his baseline." Dr. Keller had been treating Marcus for 5 years and 8 months. She had his intake file, his progression notes, his functional limitation reports, the reports that had gone to the insurance carrier, the reports that had established, on paper, that Marcus Whitmore could not perform sustained physical labor and required ongoing support. She knew his history better than anyone outside this house. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I want to be transparent with you as well. If there's a discrepancy between what I observe and what's been documented, I have professional obligations." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on that." "She came on Thursday. I did not tell Marcus until Wednesday evening." He was in the living room when I mentioned it, sitting in the recliner with his left leg elevated the way he always kept it when Ellen was home to see. He looked up from the television. "Why?" "Because I want to make sure we're doing everything right," I said. "You've been saying for a while now that you're not ready to go back to work. I want Dr. Keller to confirm what the situation actually is, so we can plan." He watched me for a moment. His expression was careful. Marcus had always been careful with his expressions around me, more so in the last year. I thought, though I could not have said exactly when that shift had started. "I've been having a harder time lately," he said. "The cold makes it worse." "Then the evaluation will show that," I said. Ellen found me in the kitchen after Marcus had gone to bed. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke, the way she did when she was choosing her words. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Calling Sandra Keller, setting this up. You've never done that before. You've always just trusted what Marcus said." "I want to make sure," I said. "Make sure of what, Gerald?" The coffee maker had finished its cycle and gone quiet. I poured a cup and set the pot back on the burner. That we're helping him the right way, that we're not missing something. Ellen looked at me the way she had looked at me a few times over the past 6 years, not with suspicion. Exactly. But with the particular attention of someone who knows you well enough to know when you're not saying everything. She had trusted me for 31 years. She trusted me now, but she was watching. "He's our son," she said. "I know. I don't want him to feel like we're testing him." "We're not testing him," I said. "We're getting an evaluation from his doctor." She nodded slowly. She was not satisfied, but she accepted it. She went to bed, and I stayed in the kitchen for another 20 minutes, looking at the legal pad on the counter with its short, crossed-out lines, and the photographs I had printed and placed in a manila folder in the cabinet above the refrigerator. 6 years. Every copay, every grocery run, every month I had looked at the account balance and told myself this was what love required. I had built a life around the belief that Marcus needed me, and I had not stopped to ask, until recently, whether the need was real or whether I had simply made it easy for him to believe it was. The rain had stopped by then. The street outside was wet and quiet. I closed the legal pad, put it in the drawer beneath the counter, and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. Dr. Keller arrived at 8:45, 10 minutes before she said she would. I heard her car in the driveway, a dark blue Subaru, same model as the one my neighbor Carol drives, and I was already at the door before she reached the porch steps. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a clipboard tucked under her arm. She was in her mid-40s, with the kind of posture that comes from years of watching other people's bodies and correcting her own by reflex. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and shook my hand. Her grip was firm and brief. I told her Marcus was upstairs. I told her he'd had a difficult night. She nodded once. The way professionals nod when they've heard that sentence many times, and it means very little to them without the data behind it. Ellen was in the kitchen. I'd told her the night before that Dr. Keller was coming for a reassessment, that the insurance file needed updating after 6 years. Ellen had said that sounded reasonable. She poured coffee for herself and didn't ask anything else. That was the thing about Ellen. She trusted the shape of an explanation, even when the inside was hollow. She had been doing that for a long time. I think she was tired. Marcus was awake when we came in. He was lying on his back, the blanket pulled to his chest, his head turned slightly toward the window. The curtains were half drawn. The room smelled like sleep and something faintly medicinal, a smell I'd learned, over 6 years, to associate with a version of my son I was no longer sure I recognized. "Hey, Doc," he said. His voice was soft, a little rough. He did not look at me. "Doctor?" Keller set her bag on the chair beside the bed and opened it without ceremony. She put on a pair of nitrile gloves. She asked Marcus how he was feeling. He said the same as always. She asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. He said 5 or 6. She wrote something on the clipboard. I moved to the corner of the room near the window and stood there. I didn't pull up a chair. I didn't cross my arms. I just stood. She began the assessment the way she always did, from what I'd read in the case notes, starting at the extremities, working inward. She asked Marcus to flex his left foot. He did it slowly, his face arranged into the expression I had seen hundreds of times, a slight tightening around the eyes, a controlled exhale, the performance of effort. She watched his foot. She asked him to flex the right. Same thing. Then she asked him to raise his left leg 6 inches off the mattress and hold it. He raised it. He held it. His face tightened again. He let it down after about 4 seconds. Dr. Keller made a note. She asked him to raise it again and hold it for 30 seconds this time. He raised it. He held it. At the 12-second mark, his leg came down. "That's okay," she said, and her voice was neutral. "Let's try something a little different." She asked him to bend his right knee and bring his heel toward his body, then straighten it again, a simple range of motion test. He did it once. She asked him to repeat it continuously, at a steady pace, for 60 seconds. He started, one repetition, then another. His pace was slow and deliberate. His face was doing everything right, the slight grimace, the careful breath. But I had spent 22 years assessing things for a living. I had spent those years learning the difference between what a body does and what a person wants you to think their body is doing. I was not the expert in this room. Dr. Keller was. She watched his leg move through the 3rd repetition, then the 4th. Her pen was still. She was not writing. She was watching the way a person watches when they have stopped gathering information and started forming a conclusion. At the 8th repetition, Marcus slowed and stopped. "I need a minute," he said. Dr. Keller said, "Of course." She made a mark on the clipboard. Then she said, almost conversationally, "Marcus, how long have you been able to do that movement?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "That particular motion, the knee bend, the extension. How long has it been back in your range?" "I don't know," he said. "A few weeks. Maybe. I've been working on it." She nodded slowly. "I see." She made another note. Then she said, "I'd like to do one more test. I want you to stand up, just for a moment, just next to the bed. You can hold the headboard if you need to." The room was very quiet. Ellen's coffee cup clinked once against the counter downstairs. The grab bars on the wall had cost $340. Dale from Beaverton had bolted them to the tile himself on a Tuesday in November of the first year. The adjustable bed frame had cost $1,100. I had written those checks the same way I had written all the others, without hesitation, because I believed that was what love looked like when it was required of you. Marcus looked at the headboard. He looked at Dr. Keller. He did not look at me. He reached for the headboard and pulled himself upright. He stood beside the bed. His feet were flat on the floor. His knees were not shaking. Dr. Keller watched him stand. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at her clipboard, then back at Marcus, and I saw her write something in the margin, a short notation, circled once. "Thank you," she said. "That's very helpful." Dr. Keller set her clipboard on the dresser. She did it slowly, the way someone sets down something they no longer need to hold. Then she turned to face Marcus directly, and her voice was the same even tone it had been since she walked through the front door, clinical, unhurried, giving nothing away. "Marcus," she said, "if you can't walk without assistance, how were you playing basketball at Westmoreland Park last Wednesday afternoon?" The room went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Ellen, standing near the doorway, stopped moving. I watched Marcus's face from where I stood by the window, and I counted 3 full seconds before any muscle in it changed. His color went first. The flush that had been there a moment ago, the slight effort of standing, drained out of him in a single pass, the way water clears from a glass when you tip it. He looked at Dr. Keller. He looked at the wall behind her. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about," but the sentence had no weight to it. It arrived already broken. "I wasn't at Westmoreland," he said. "I can't work anymore. I can barely get across the room." That was when I walked to the chair beside the nightstand and picked up the envelope I had placed there before Dr. Keller arrived. I had not told Marcus it was there. I had not told Ellen either. I pulled out 4 photographs. Kevin had taken them on his phone, and I had printed them that morning at the FedEx on Burnside, and I set them on the bed in front of Marcus, one at a time. In the first, Marcus was at the top of his jump, both feet off the ground, left arm extended. In the second, he was running a fast break, full stride, no hesitation. In the third, he was laughing. In the fourth, he had one hand on someone's shoulder, catching his breath after the game. Marcus looked at the photographs. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at me. There was no version of a sentence he could start that I hadn't already heard in my head 1,000 times. Every excuse, every explanation, every reframing of what those images might mean. I had spent 22 years investigating claims for a living. I knew what a man looked like when the story he had been telling finally ran out of road. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Dr. Keller picked up her clipboard from the dresser. She wrote something else in the margin, longer this time, and did not circle it. Marcus's hands were still on the last photograph when he started to cry. It wasn't the kind of crying that comes from being caught. I've seen that. I spent 2 decades watching people discover they'd been found out, and that cry is different. It's faster, more urgent, like a man grabbing for something he just knocked off a shelf. This was slower. His shoulders dropped first, then his chin, and the sound that came out of him was the sound of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, finally giving way. Dr. Keller didn't move from her position near the dresser. She set the clipboard down quietly, the way you set something down when you want to make sure the sound doesn't interrupt what's happening in the room. Ellen was standing in the doorway. She had come upstairs when she heard the silence, the particular kind of silence that fills a house differently than noise does. I had not asked her to come, but she was there now, and I didn't ask her to leave. Marcus wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at the photographs spread across the blanket. He said, "I didn't know how to stop." I waited. After the accident, after the real accident, I was scared. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his own hands, the ones that had been photographed carrying a cooler at Kevin's backyard cookout last July. The physical therapy helped. Dr. Keller knows that. I got most of the movement back, but I kept thinking, what if I go back and I can't keep up? What if I fail? What if you see me fail? He stopped, started again. "You were always so capable. You always knew what to do." I never figured out how to be that. I got scared, and then it was easier to stay scared than to do anything about it. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator running 2 floors below. "Kevin told me it couldn't go on forever," Marcus said. "He said it every time I saw him. He said you were going to figure it out eventually." He laughed at that short, broken sound. He was right. Ellen made a small noise from the doorway. Not a word, just a sound, the kind a person makes when something lands in a place they weren't prepared for. I looked at my son, 38 years old, sitting in a bed he had spent 6 years convincing me he couldn't leave without help. The photographs were still on the blanket between us, him carrying a bag of mulch at a hardware store, him standing at a counter in a coffee shop near the east side, him and Kevin playing cornhole in a backyard on a Tuesday afternoon when he had told me he was resting because his back had been bad that week. I had spent 6 years driving him to appointments he didn't need, filling prescriptions that kept him comfortable, transferring money on the first of every month because he couldn't work, and I wasn't going to let my son go without. I had watched Ellen adjust her schedule around his needs. I had watched her stop making plans because Marcus might need something. I had watched a woman who used to take long drives on Sunday mornings sit at a kitchen table waiting to hear if he needed lunch brought upstairs. I said, "Marcus." He looked up. "You lied to me for 6 years." I kept my voice level. Not cold, I wasn't performing anything. I was just tired of raising it. "You took money I worked for. You took time I cannot get back. You let your mother rearrange her life around a condition you didn't have, and in 6 years, you never once decided that the truth was something I deserved to hear." He started to say something. I held up one hand, not aggressively, just enough to indicate that I wasn't finished. "I'm not asking you to explain it to me right now. I understand the explanation. I've understood it for a while." I picked up one of the photographs from the blanket, the one from the cornhole game, and set it on the nightstand. What I want you to understand is what you actually took, not the money. The money is a number. What you took was the version of these 6 years where I could have trusted that what I was doing mattered. You made it so that every time I helped you, I was helping a fiction. You understand that. Marcus nodded. His face was wet and he wasn't bothering to wipe it anymore. Ellen stepped into the room. She moved to the chair near the window, the one Marcus used to sit in before the accident, and she lowered herself into it carefully, the way she moved when she was trying not to take up too much space in a situation she didn't fully have words for yet. She looked at Marcus, and then she looked at me, and then she looked at her hands. Dr. Keller picked up her clipboard again. She wrote something at the bottom of the page, uncapped and recapped her pen, and then she said, "I want to say something before I go, if that's all right." No one told her it wasn't. "I've had patients fake symptoms before," she said. "Not often, but it happens. Usually it's for insurance, or to avoid something specific, a court date, a deployment, a custody arrangement. What I don't see as often is someone faking for 6 years without a clear external benefit." She looked at Marcus, not unkindly. "That's not a defense, but it's something worth understanding. Whatever you were afraid of, it was real, even if the disability wasn't." Marcus looked at her. He said, "That doesn't make it okay." "No," she said, "it doesn't." She closed the clipboard. She looked at me and said, "I'll update his records to reflect today's assessment. Full range of motion, no evidence of chronic impairment. If you need that documentation for any purpose, it will be there." She paused. "I'm sorry this is how it came out." I thanked her. She picked up her bag from the floor near the dresser, nodded once to Ellen, and left the room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, steady and unhurried. The front door opened and closed. The 3 of us were alone. Ellen spoke first. She said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough to prepare," I said. She absorbed that. She looked at Marcus again, and I watched her face move through something I recognized, not anger, not yet, but the specific disorientation that comes when a version of a person you love turns out to have a different floor plan than you thought. She had been adjusting her life around his limitations for 6 years. She had defended him to her sister when her sister said he seemed fine. She had told me more than once that I needed to be more patient with him, that recovery wasn't linear. She didn't say any of that now. She just sat in the chair and looked at her son. Marcus said, "Mom, I'm sorry." Ellen nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. I looked at Marcus. I said, "Monday morning, you are going to look for work. I don't care what it is. You find something, and you start it." I kept my voice even. "If you don't, I'm going to file a fraud complaint. Not because I want to, because 6 years of financial support obtained under false pretenses has a name, and I've known what that name is for a long time. I kept quiet because I was hoping I was wrong. I wasn't wrong." Marcus said, "I know. I need to hear you say you understand what I just said." "I understand," he said. "I'll find something. I'll start Monday." I looked at him for a moment longer. Then I picked up the photographs from the blanket, squared them against my palm, and set them on the nightstand next to the first one. "Get some rest," I said, not sarcastically. I meant it. He looked exhausted in the way that people look when they've been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down doesn't feel like relief. It just feels like a different kind of weight. I walked out of the room. Ellen followed me into the hallway. She pulled the door partially closed behind her and stood with her back against the wall, looking at the floor. After a moment, she said, "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," I said. "You loved your son and you believed him. Those aren't the same thing as being an idiot." "I told you to be more patient with him." "I know." She looked up. "Were you angry when I said that?" I thought about it. "I was," I said. "But not at you." She nodded. She looked at the closed door. She said, "What happens now?" "He finds work," I said. "We figure out the rest as it comes." She didn't ask me whether I thought things would be all right. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't answer that with anything useful, and she was right. I didn't know whether things would be all right. I knew that the thing that had been wrong for 6 years had finally been named out loud in a room with 3 witnesses, and that naming it didn't fix it, but it did mean we were all standing on the same ground now, which was more than we'd had an hour ago. I went downstairs. The living room was the way I'd left it, Marcus's wheelchair folded against the wall near the television, the grab bar still bolted to the wall beside the couch, the small ramp we'd had installed at the back door still sitting in the track. I had not removed any of it beforehand. I had wanted him to see it all still in place when he came downstairs on his own 2 feet, which he would, starting Monday. I sat in the chair by the window. Outside, a neighbor was walking a dog along the sidewalk, moving at the dog's pace, which was slow and interested in everything. The light was the particular gray gold of late afternoon in Portland in October, the kind that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time. I sat there for a while. I didn't feel like a man who had won something. I felt like a man who had finished a job he had never wanted to be assigned. The difference matters. Winning feels like something. Finishing a job like this just feels like the absence of the thing that was wrong. And the absence of something wrong is not the same as the presence of something right. The wheelchair was still folded against the wall. I looked at it for a long time. Then I got up and went to make coffee. Marcus started work on November 3rd. I know the date because Ellen mentioned it at dinner that night, not to me directly, but to the room. The way she'd started talking in those weeks, as if she was narrating her own life to an audience that wasn't quite there. She said, "He called this afternoon. First day went fine." She set a bowl of soup on the table and sat down. Neither of us said anything else about it. The company was Hargrove Construction, a mid-sized outfit that did commercial builds in the Pearl District and occasionally out toward Beaverton. I'd known their foreman, a man named Dale Pruitt. For about 12 years, we'd crossed paths twice during insurance investigations involving subcontractor disputes. Dale was the kind of man who didn't ask many questions but noticed everything. When Marcus applied, Dale called me, not to ask permission, just to let me know. I appreciated that more than I said. Marcus was hired as a site coordinator. It was the kind of work he'd done before the accident, or before the years he'd spent telling us there had been an accident that had changed everything. The job required walking job sites, reviewing materials deliveries, managing schedules. It required, in other words, a functioning body. He did it without a wheelchair, without a cane, without the particular slow shuffle he'd used for 6 years every time Ellen or I was watching. I didn't ask Dale how Marcus was doing. I didn't need to. Kevin called on a Friday, about 3 weeks into Marcus's first month at Hargrove. He said he'd been at the Pearl District site on a claims consult, a subcontractor dispute, the kind of thing that brought former investigators back into circulation. He said he'd walked through the site with Dale Pruitt and seen Marcus coordinating a materials delivery near the east entrance. Marcus had been carrying a clipboard, moving between the crew and the truck, calling out measurements. Kevin said he'd watched for about 2 minutes before Marcus noticed him. "He saw me," Kevin said, and once I stopped walking, just stopped. I asked what happened. "Dale was standing right there," Kevin said. "Dale knows." I could tell from the way he looked at Marcus, not mean about it, just steady, like he was waiting to see what Marcus would do. Kevin paused. Marcus walked over to me. He shook my hand. He said, "Good to see you, Kevin." That's all he said. Then he went back to the delivery. I thanked Kevin. "He looked fine," Kevin said. "Moving well, doing the work." He was quiet for a moment. "I just thought you should know he's out there doing it." I told him I appreciated that. I hung up and went back to what I'd been doing, which was reading the paper at the kitchen table. The coffee was still warm. Outside, the neighbor's dog was in the yard again, barking at something in the hedge. Marcus had shaken Kevin's hand on a job site in front of a foreman who knew exactly what the last 6 years had been. No cane, no shuffle, no careful arrangement of his face into the expression of a man managing pain. Just a handshake and a return to work. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the mug and set it in the rack. What I needed to understand, and what took me longer to accept than I'd expected, was the shape of what those 6 years had actually cost. Not the money I'd done that accounting already. Somewhere around the 3rd year, when I'd started keeping the receipts, not out of resentment, but out of the old habit of documentation, $41,000 in direct financial support, another 18 in medical consultations, physical therapy co-pays, the modifications we'd made to the house, the grab bars in the bathroom, the ramp we'd had poured at the back door, the adjustable bed frame that cost $1,100 and that Marcus had used, as far as I could tell, exactly as much as a man who didn't need it would use one, $59,000, roughly, over 6 years. That was the number. But the number wasn't the cost. Have you ever paid for something every single day, not with money, but with attention, with worry, with the specific weight of believing someone you love is suffering, and then discovered the suffering was constructed, that the architecture of your daily life had been built around a need that didn't exist? The cost wasn't $59,000. The cost was 6 years of waking up in the morning and thinking about Marcus before I thought about anything else. 6 years of Ellen adjusting her schedule, her sleep, her social life, around the rhythms of a disability that was not a disability. 6 years of conversations we didn't have because we were too tired from the conversations we did have. 6 years of the particular silence that settles into a house when everyone inside it is managing something heavy. That was what it cost, and there's no receipt for any of it. Ellen didn't talk about it directly for the first 2 weeks after Dr. Keller left the house that afternoon. She went through the motions, cooked dinner, answered her phone, went to her Thursday book club, but there was something different in the way she moved through rooms. Careful, like she was walking on a floor she wasn't certain would hold. I recognized it. I'd walked that way myself for about 3 months before I'd started making calls. On a Sunday, about 16 days after, she came into the kitchen where I was reading the paper and sat down across from me. She put both hands flat on the table. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." I put the paper down. She said, "Did you know before you called Dr. Keller before that day?" I told her I'd had a reasonable certainty for about 4 months. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I keep trying to remember a moment when I should have known, and I can't find one. I keep looking, and I can't find it." She looked at her hands. I don't know if that means I was fooled or if it means I didn't want to see it. I told her I thought both things could be true at the same time. She nodded. She got up and went back to whatever she'd been doing. That was the most we talked about it directly for a long time. What Ellen was grappling with, and what I watched her grapple with over the following weeks, quietly, in the particular way she processed things that hurt her, was not the lie itself. She'd accepted the lie as a fact quickly, the way practical people do. What she couldn't find solid ground under was the question of who Marcus had been during those 6 years. The son she'd made soup for and driven to appointments and worried over at 2 in the morning, had the person existed at all? Was the love she'd felt for a suffering child a real thing? If the suffering was invented? I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. What I knew was that Marcus had been afraid. That was the part that had taken me longer to understand than the deception itself. The deception was a method. The fear was the reason. He had been, at 32, a man who didn't know how to be a man, and who had found that the most effective way to avoid the question was to become someone who couldn't be expected to answer it. He had taken the accident which had been real, a genuine injury to his left knee that had required surgery and 8 weeks of recovery, and extended it, quietly, incrementally, until it became a life, until the recovery became permanent, until the limitations became a home he could live inside without ever having to leave. I had paid for everything. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. I paid for everything, not because I was naive. I had spent 22 years as an insurance investigator, and I had a professional skepticism of claimed disabilities that most fathers don't carry. I paid for everything because I had decided, consciously, that being wrong about my son's need was a cost I was willing to pay. That the risk of withholding help from someone who genuinely couldn't work was worse than the risk of providing it to someone who could. He had known that about me. I don't know if he'd calculated it or simply felt it, the way children feel the soft places in the people who love them, but he had known, and he had used it. And for 6 years, my willingness to be wrong had been the architecture of his escape. Marcus came to the house on a Saturday in late November. I saw his truck in the driveway from the kitchen window, a used F-150 he'd bought 2 weeks into the new job, which told me Hargrove was paying him decently. Ellen was at her sister's in Tigard. He knocked, which he hadn't done in years, and I opened the door and stood in it. He looked like he'd been rehearsing something. His hands were in his jacket pockets. He said, "Dad, can I come in?" I stepped back from the door. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ellen had put her hands down flat and asked me what I'd known and when. He looked at the surface of it for a moment. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it probably doesn't even matter to you at this point. But I need you to know that I understand what I did. I took from you not just money. I took 6 years of your life, and I built something with it that was never real. I know that." I sat down across from him. He said, "I was scared. I know that sounds like an excuse. I'm not saying it to excuse it. I'm saying it because I want you to understand what happened, even if understanding it doesn't change anything." I listened. I let him say what he'd come to say, which took about 4 minutes. When he was done, I didn't speak right away. I've learned over a long career of sitting across tables from people who had done things they needed to explain that the silence after a confession is usually more honest than the confession itself. What a person does in that silence, whether they wait or fill it or look away, tells you more about them than anything they've prepared. Marcus waited. He looked at me and waited. I said, "I hear you." He nodded. I said, "I don't know if I'll get to forgiveness. I'm not going to tell you that I will, because I don't know. What I know is that the person I thought I was helping for 6 years, I'm not sure that person was you, and I'm not sure yet who you actually are." I paused. "I'd like to find out, but I can't promise you what that looks like." He said, "That's fair." He left about 20 minutes later. I watched his truck back out of the driveway. I didn't feel like a man who had closed a chapter. I felt like a man standing in a house that had been rearranged while he was sleeping, everything in roughly the right place, but nothing quite where he'd left it. The wheelchair is gone now. I disassembled it and put it in the recycling bin on a Wednesday morning in early December. The same week, the ramp at the back door got removed by a contractor named Phil Okafor, who did the job in about 2 hours and didn't ask why. The grab bars in the bathroom are still there. I've left them. They don't bother me. And at 62, I'm not opposed to the idea that I might find them useful myself someday. A relationship built on a lie is not a relationship. That's not a complicated thing to say, but I've found it takes a long time to actually feel the truth of it, to understand it, not as a sentence, but as a lived fact. What Marcus and I had for 6 years was a structure. It had the shape of a father and son. It had the vocabulary of care and need and provision. But underneath it, the load-bearing walls were made of something that couldn't hold. And when those walls came down, what was left wasn't the relationship we'd thought we were in. It was the question of whether there was anything underneath the structure worth building from. I don't know the answer to that yet. I think Marcus doesn't either. What I know is that love, when it's real, doesn't require you to disappear into it. It doesn't require you to become the proof that someone else's story is true. I loved my son. I paid for everything because I loved him. And I would do it again under the same circumstances because the man I was when I made those choices was a man who believed he was doing right. And I won't disown that man just because the belief turned out to be wrong. But I know now that love without the ability to see clearly is not protection. It's participation. And there's a difference between carrying someone and being used as the floor they walk on. Tell me about a time you held on to something longer than you should have: a person, a belief, a version of someone you'd decided was real. Tell me what finally made you let go, or whether you're still holding. Tell me what you found on the other side of that, if you got there, because every story told honestly is proof that the rest of us aren't alone in the rooms where we've sat and counted what we lost, and that the counting, eventually, is how we find the way out. If you've ever loved someone past the point where the evidence supported it, past the receipts, past the silence, past the version of them you kept choosing over the one standing in front of you, then you already understand why this story took 6 years to end, and why the ending wasn't loud. These are the rooms I keep returning to. If they mean something to you, I'll keep the light on.